We're going to go ahead and get started as soon as the organizers give me the thumbs up.
Hello.
Hi, my name is Nick Merrick, and we're here to talk about the future of housing. Broad topic, but we have two people who touch the real estate and housing industry here in Texas and some around the country. And we have a lot of very interesting things to talk about. We have Leo Vasquez and we have Matthew Berke. And I guess what I would like each of you to do is that both of you are involved in addressing the low-income housing and issues of housing and affordability. One as a steward of the public purse, and the other engaging with funding from the public purse, but doing it in a for-profit model. So if each of you could give a little bit of your backgrounds and then sort of just talk about generally how you interact with housing in your respective roles.
Hi, my name is Matthew Berke. I own Hahn Partners. We're definitely the largest in Texas owner of single-family homes in what's called high-opportunity neighborhoods. So that would be Little Elm or Frisco or Plano, good neighborhoods with good schools. And we're the largest in that we rent exclusively to Section 8 tenants. We will not accept a private tenant, which was quite novel because most of the time it's the opposite. I founded it in 2019. Prior to that, I had started an energy management company and sold it in 2012. I didn't do much afterwards. I have 3 kids and my wife. But at one point, I was speaking at a conference, and someone came over to me and said, there are Section 8 tenants, primarily single moms, with vouchers from the government, federal government, that pay market rent, who cannot find a landlord. And I grew up with a single mom. We didn't have much money, so I knew what it felt like to be on the wrong side of society's smile. And so I said, let me see if I could do it. And it turns out to be a good business and a good moral cause. And as you can imagine, I have a lot of stories to tell you. So that's my background.
Okay, Leo?
Great. I'm Leo Vasquez. As it says, I'm chairman of the governing board of the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. I'll tell you a little bit about what that organization actually does. My background is more in my real life. I do corporate finance consulting work, kind of strategy, mergers and acquisitions, and lots of real estate, lots of arguing with lawyers. The TDHCA is the state's organization which deals, it's best known for working with the low-income housing tax credit program. So that's a federal program where we can award these tax credits to a development, whether it's a for-profit or nonprofit. It's all a scoring system. We issue about $1.3 or $130 million a year in tax credits that get awarded on, there's 2 types, 9% and 4%. But it's not just $130 million, it's actually a 10-year award. So that's really $1.3 billion a year of tax credits that we put out there. And we can talk a little bit more about some of the numbers on those developments. We also help with issuing first-time homebuyer mortgages, originating mortgages. We do about $2.5 billion a year in mortgages as well in Texas that we help originate. To help fund that, we issue tax-exempt bonds. We then use the money from the bond issuance, buy the mortgages as we get paid back. Then we have the mortgages, we bundle them, collateralize them, and sell them back and keep recycling the money. And those are kind of the major on that side. Then there's the community affairs aspect. We put out several $100 million a year in community development block grants, working on everything from utilities assistance to weatherization programs to migrant farmer housing inspections. So that part goes big. In the last couple of years, following the pandemic, so part of the American Rescue Plan, we took I think about $2 billion in rental assistance programs through the state of Texas that ran through TDHCA. We currently are in the middle of another homeowners assistance program that's another $1 billion a year, or well, one time $1 billion, and the rental assistance was one time $2 billion. This is all money that kind of gets circulated back that we send up to the federal government, and then it comes back to the states. And Texas, since we're one of the biggest states, those numbers are probably considerably higher than a whole bunch of other states. I think as we go along, I can talk a little bit more about the number of units we build and the shortage of affordable housing, the different models that people are using. So I'd love to talk about that as well.
Sure. So in both cases, we're really starting with federal funding, correct, for the most part?
Yes.
Okay. And,
Yeah, 100%.
yes. So talk a little bit, both of you, about, we've all seen those memes where you have sort of the ball that goes down here that touches this, that does that impacts this, that leads to that makes the squirt gun work, that fills the clowns, all that kind of stuff. So talk about the movement of federal money into housing, what you guys directly touch, and where there are barriers and where there are facilitators.
May I go first? Okay. Again, it's a complex topic, and I'm glad to see so many people here, because on all of these programs that have been discussed over these last couple of days, one of the most fundamental parts of helping people help themselves and do well is housing. I mean, if you don't have solid, clean, stable housing, it's more than just four walls and a roof. Housing is such an integral part of just the social determinants of health, for instance. All these pieces, like you said, kind of bounce around and touch each other. It really gets complex. And then there's a whole different levels of the truly homeless that you see out on the streets to people making less than 30% of the area median income, and then all the way up to 80 and 100% and 120%. There's workforce housing, there's senior housing, there's supportive housing. All these different areas get impacted, and then the different programs to fund it, like Matthew uses with the 8A housing vouchers program. It just, again, it's an interlocking 3D puzzle that all fits together.
So unfortunately, the federal government, whether it's Republican or Democrat, is the #1 obstacle to affordable housing. They claim they want it. I don't believe it. I'll give you examples, and just very simple ones. So they tell us we want to house Section 8 tenants in the suburbs. And I say, great. We're going to buy a bunch of 4-bedroom houses. That's all you can buy in the suburbs. They don't build 3-bedroom houses. And the federal government says, sorry, the majority of the vouchers are 3-bedroom, eligible only. Like, okay, well, we can't buy them. What are we supposed to do? And I'm telling you, Republican and Democrat, there's no difference. They love to fall back on the real trope, greedy landlords. You talk to any of them. Why is there not affordable housing? Greedy landlords. We're not a greedy landlord. We only rent to Section 8. And the HUD loves us, and I can tell you stories about that. And so one example would be, if you want people to live in the suburbs, maybe give them a voucher that underwrites the very homes that are in the suburbs. Maybe. They won't do it. I think they won't do it because the truth is that housing, HUD, has been underfunded over 50 to 60 years. I heard that from senior Republican congressmen in housing. And so it's easier for them. It's like a debit card, a gift card you give your kid, and the store hopes the kid loses the card so that it never gets redeemed. That's really what the federal government and the states want with housing. They want to tell everybody affordable housing. They want to blame greedy landlords. And then they hope to God they're going to put enough rules in where you cannot actualize the voucher. Netflix had a movie recently where, The Maid or something, it was like a real big deal, because in using an expletive, she said, you tell me I have a voucher, and it's basically useless. So they want breakage. Telling you, they want it. Because if everybody utilized the voucher that they had, HUD's budget would go from 50 billion, which has only gone up 1% a year, to 100 billion. Is that happening? Nope. So, honest to goodness, it's not the landlords. Our landlords greedy? Sure, yeah, I could tell you all the stories. But it's really those sort of laws that prevent real housing. One other one. Here's a great one. So they'll post rents. Well, you have to buy a home based on the rent, right? I mean, who's going to buy a home without knowing the rent? Oh, no. They also have to make sure it's reasonable after you buy the house. I'm like, you posted the rent. I didn't. It's your rents that the federal government posted with all your experts saying that Little Elm rent is $3,200 a month. I'm going to buy the home on that calculation. Oh, but then you're telling me after I buy the home and submit the deed, you have the right to check it if it's reasonable. Well, you're the ones who said it. Why are you checking if it's reasonable? Oh, and guess what? When you check it's reasonable and your budget is maybe a little tight, you say, we found a house on Main Street that rented for $2,700. The fact that it was a widow, like who owned the house for 50 years, doesn't know real estate, doesn't really matter. All of a sudden, the $3,200 they posted is $2,700. You bought the house on $32,000, and you're done. You're gone. So why do they do that? Why? So my theory is that it's easier for them to blame greedy landlords, Wall Street, all the famous whipping boys or girls, versus acknowledge that it's just underfunded. That's the truth.
So Matthew, part of your cell is you have 3 bedrooms plus a wine room for a lot of these ones that you're renting, right? To get around that government.
We have a massage.
Yeah. Okay.
Spa.
All right. So Leo, when we think of government programs, we think of a $1 million expenditure, and you have the one extreme where people are hired to dig a hole on day one, and then they're hired the next day to fill the hole. And there's $1 million of government spending that makes its way into the economy. And you can think of another kind of physical example where 2 communities that have never been connected, there's a bridge that's built between the two with the $1 million. And you can just think of all the 1 + 1 = 3 aspects of that. As someone who stewards government dollars, what is your filter and frame of reference as you think about how to most effectively spend those dollars to achieve a 1 + 1 = something much greater than 2 versus the dig a hole, fill the hole example?
Yeah, no, and I just want to say, I agree with everything Matthew just said. I probably am not as negative about I'm looking at it a little more half full than the half empty part. But in relating to these numbers that you're talking about moving up, there's some studies that I've recently seen, and actually I published earlier this year, again, I'm on my blog site for leovasquez.com, all these statistics on some of the studies show that there's about a 7 million unit shortage of affordable housing across the United States. 7 million. That was before another 5 million people just came across into the United States. And odds are most of them are going to be living in affordable housing. Where are we going to put all these people? How do we maximize the dollars that are coming into the system? And that's something at TDHCA that we're trying to use as more of a tiebreaker on, because we have limited funds from HUD or the federal government on tax credits. Well, there may be someplace really nice in a high opportunity area that their per unit cost is like $300,000 for apartments, okay? Versus we could put it in a area needing reinvestment and their per door cost might be $180,000. So we have a limited number. How do we maximize that? At the same time, we have to balance out. I mean, it's beautiful putting opportunities for people to live in a nice neighborhood with good schools. On the other hand, I'm sure you probably are facing some of the NIMBYism at times, or, not in my backyard. Hey, we want affordable housing, just not in my neighborhood, right? That we come up with all the time. Then we also have people that are balancing out, trying to say, take this limited money you have and reinvest it back in our neighborhood that needs investment, because we don't have any place good to live in these low opportunity neighborhoods. It's all a balancing act, and how do we maximize that number. And the last thing before I forget, which I already did, what Matthew's talking about with the problems being faced by the greedy landlords, the for-profit side of it, the nonprofit side is having the same issues and it being faced with those same types of restrictions that Matthew's saying on the for-profit side. So it's not just that, it's even the purely altruistic, not-for-profits are faced with those same problems and trying to, again, maximize their investment, maximize the number of units that they can put out.
Yeah, just as a point of observation, I just saw a chart the other day that housing affordability is at its absolute worst point ever, meaning the average cost of an average home vis-a-vis the average income of an American family. So, where do you begin? Where do you end? Where do you intervene on that issue? If that's the Fed, that's the federal government, that's global markets, that's all sorts of things, globalization, onshoring. All those issues are relevant in a discussion like this, although we're not going to try to hit all those. Matthew, we know you want to be aspirational. So in addition to putting the roof over a family in a middle-class school district, walk us through one or two examples of a prototypical family, how long they've had to wait for the voucher, where did they move to, talk about some of the benefits that they experienced beyond just being in a nicer home, and then also maybe one or two things where the community benefited from their inclusion.
I will, and I'll end off with a shameless plug for volunteers, because that's beyond honoring Catherine, that's why I'm here. I'll tell you what we're doing on the volunteer side. So the tenants, they may wait 6-7 years for a voucher. And this is not Leo's fault. He's getting money from the feds. And it's bipartisan, both sides of underfunded housing. So it's more complicated.
We don't issue the vouchers. That comes from the feds.
I'm struck by the fact, and maybe the young people, Catherine's generation, can one day point out to this country that they funded $1 trillion for clean energy, Tesla, and $50 billion for affordable housing. And that's a capital allocation by the citizens of the United States, right? To decide whether that could be equalized a little better. Because the clean energy tax credits and other things is enormous, and housing is not. And that's just up for citizens and to decide. They'll wait 6 or 7 years for the voucher. The reason I decided to only rent to Section 8 tenants, including private tenants, call us up and we say no, and we're in fantastic neighborhoods. The reason was that at first I gave my cell phone out for leasing. I don't know, why not? I wanted to talk to them, these tenants. And then I went out to lunch with them. They started to cry because here's a day in the life of a Section 8 tenant. They have 5 kids screaming in the background. Hello, Catherine Realty, could I rent your home? No. Hello, Catherine Realty, could I rent your home? No. Hello, Catherine Realty, could I rent your home? No. Hello, Catherine Realty. Yes, give me $50, apply, and we'll tell you. And of course the answer is no. Whom of us like that much rejection? Right? Would you like to do that all day? Call 20, 30, 40 times a day and basically be told no. So I decided that that's not why I got into this business. I'm not claiming to be a saint and I make money off this, but I was not interested in saying no. And because I was leasing at that point, I really didn't feel like saying no to them. So I said, okay, that's it. We won't play jump ball with those tenants. We will not. You're Section 8, we're going to take you. That's our business. And we're not going to prioritize, sorry to pick on you, Catherine, but Catherine. By the way, 99% of real estate wants Catherine and not our Section 8 tenants for obvious reasons. So they finally, so the day in life in our tenant is we say yes, but the day in life in most Section 8 tenants is they can't find a house. They have 60 or 90 days or 120, depending on the rules, to actualize the voucher, or it's gone. Gone, gone, gone. And I really am like apolitical, I really am, so I'll just say, I now understand why there's a massive trust gap amongst people, low-income Americans in this country. Because they are given rules that are designed to fail. They really are. And this is their home where they're going to live. These are all, so when they finally get a landlord to say, I'll accept you, they typically have to pay $50 to $100 application fee. 99% of the time, they're not getting, that landlord had no interest in accepting them ever, and they pocket the $100. We charge 0 application fee. Because I don't want to do that to people. Like, it's just horrible. Like, they have no money. So our tenants, I think, are particularly happy with us. We do charge security deposit. It's hard. We are a for-profit business, and some of these tenants don't take care of the home. And we do charge security deposit. We do force them to put utilities in their name, which is I know it's a burden on them, because then they have to call the utility company and who charges them a big security deposit too. But we have to. We can't take the risk that utilities is on them. Look, a lot of their lives are very, 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 it's in disarray. I have 3 kids. I've been married almost 30 years. I've got a good amount of money, and I found raising kids hard. Our Section 8 moms are single moms with 5, 6 kids, no money, a system they don't really understand, but mostly works against them. That's the truth. So, and then they get into spats with neighbors. There's sad stories, ex-girlfriend, boyfriend, stuff that's not good. There's stuff they do to themselves. You know, they have PTSD. So what I decided to do was go to a local Dallas Jewish organization that I knew well, and they run young professionals. You know, real smart, lawyer, 20, you know, the Jewish version of Catherine. Sorry to pick it. It's okay, Leslie. Okay. So I say, Catherine, can you be a social worker for them? We're going to assign you to one of our tenants. You're their friend. You're their mentor. They'll cry to you. They'll fight with the neighbor, and maybe you'll go over and try to sort it out. You'll help them with benefits. You'll be their mentor. They feel absolutely alone. We're doing that. It's volunteer. We cannot underwrite a social worker cost per tenant based on the real estate economics. So it's all volunteer. We have 650 homes, and my goal is by the end of the year to have 650 of those volunteers. The Jewish organization will produce, well, it depends, 100, 150, I hope. So if anyone in the crowd is serious about helping a single mom who's made bad decisions, who has 5, 6, 7 kids, who may have a former husband who's abusive and looking for them, who may get into spats with their neighbors that to us, who may not mow their lawn, where the HOA comes down on them like it's the electric chair. I mean, pictures, you're a quarter of an inch too high, fines, oh yeah, your basketball net has a ripped net, they come after them. And so that's really my goal, is to assign each one of them one volunteer who could essentially be their protector. And we're going to do it because I know that in this country there's an excess supply of people who want to help. They do, but it's hard to find the right vehicle. You go to a homeless shelter, okay, fine, you do that. You go to United Way, okay, fine. But person-to-person help.
So, Leo, I'm going to pivot to you in a second, but Matthew, one follow-up. Talk about the relevance of the school district. When you mention the kids, what does that do in terms of building bridges or creating barriers, and does that help create any sort of return beyond the obvious?
Yeah, so this whole program, Pioneer Neighborhood, was started because Raj Chetty out of Harvard, who is youngest PhD economist in Harvard history at 23. He's a real smart guy. And he basically took IRS tax records and was able to prove what we all know, that if you live in a good neighborhood, chances are your kids will be fine. Like that, they had to wait 15 years to prove that is kind of sad. That's how the federal government works. 15 years to wait for those kids who are 3 to become 18 and see if they're in jail, like when it's intuitive that. So they're in public schools. They're in public schools in Forney and Little Elm. The parents tell me that the teacher responds, that they actually get an email. I mean, it's night and day, their experience. But I don't want to paint an exclusively rosy picture. There's some tough stories. There's some tough stories of kids who bring bad behavior to these schools. It's a very complicated issue. It's easy for me to get out there and sound like Mother Teresa, and we do a lot of good, but it's hard. It's hard. By and large, though, the parents and the kids do well and are very, 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 very happy to be amongst good schools. Very happy.
So, Leo, I've always been taught that you can't manage something unless you measure it. So maybe talk about how you measure the various outlays that you are responsible for and how that affects decision making. And then obviously anything you want to comment on what Matthew has said. He has said a few things. I think we all would note that. So go ahead.
Okay, let me answer that, how we measure the outcomes last before I forget all the things I want to talk about that following on with what Matthew just said. The example about calling the over and over and over trying to find some place to rent. Part of the statistics that I was talking about, and I like numbers and I'm finance, but I like applying them to the real world. In the availability of housing, the higher end is pretty much universally acknowledged to be in equilibrium. So if someone wants to rent someplace nice, someone's going to build someplace nice for them to rent. And that pretty much stays in equilibrium. Where it's out of whack is on the low end, that where people can only afford a affordable housing unit, affordable rental unit, but no one can build them because the rehab costs are too much. The supply chain is still completely messed up on all over the place. Insurance costs have gone through the roof in the last couple of years. So when everyone in this room can pick up the phone and call and say, hey, I'd like to rent from there, you have a whole bunch of choices that you can rent from. On the other side of the spectrum, there's just not even enough supply, and especially when you narrow it down to places that'll accept vouchers. The aspect that you were talking about with getting the volunteers, getting people to work, one of my, if I could flip a switch, if someone in this room says, Leo, I want you to do this program, what I would want to do is take some of the models that we call supportive housing and with wraparound services that there's mostly nonprofits end up doing this, but we get people into housing with the 4 walls and the roof and it's safe and clean. But if these people are only making $12.50 an hour, if they're making $12.50 an hour, look at her, look at that. If it's only $12.50 an hour, they're never going to be able to move out up into a better place. Let's get them. Let's again bring healthcare to the units. Let's bring daycare to the units and evening care. Get the parents in schools and getting other certifications and raising their skill set. Where instead of making $12.50 an hour, they're making $25, $30 an hour. Then you can move them up into out of affordable housing into workforce housing, from there into market rate housing, and then from there buying their own house, eventually if they get that skill set. But you have to wrap them around with all those services. The community volunteers that Matthew's talking about is a great start, and it's an important aspect to everyone. I mean, we all here know how to balance our checkbook, right? I mean, a lot of these, folks just can't even get that kind of step done. If we put all these extra services around them, increase their outcomes, their skill sets, that's going to make a huge difference. On the schools, this is a battle that at TDHCA we have all the time. There are requirements that we can't award tax credits to a development if a school is failing or unrated now. They don't fail the schools anymore. They just don't rate them. So if you're not rated, you're basically failing. So does that mean we don't reinvest in a unit in a development in that area? So we're just saying, that's it, we're just cutting you off, and anyone in that community, tough luck, we're not going to, especially on the rehab parts where people are already living there, let's rehab it and the development and give them a nicer, safer, cleaner place to live. It's a balancing act. When we've had times where we're going to reject the property, an application, but they'll bring in the school superintendent, they'll bring in the head of the PTA, they'll bring in the city council, and everyone showing here we're investing all this effort, not just money, but all the other services to improve the schools. Usually we'll believe them, and give them that benefit of the doubt, but not every time. That's such a balancing act on, do you effectively abandon that school district or that area, or do you reinvest and try to help pull up the whole thing? I guess the final part you're asking about the
measurements.
The measurements. Yeah. That's something that's very important. Not half, but a big part of our organization, part of the deal for us giving you these tax credits, or I failed to mention, we give direct loans and at 40-year amortizations and really low interest rates and such as well. And that's hundreds of millions of dollars a year as well. But in return for that, you're guaranteeing us that, I'm just picking numbers, 30% of the units are going to be 30% AMI or lower. 20% are going to be under 50, 30 to 50, and then 70 or 25% under 80. The rest can be market rate. If you're making us that promise and that's part of your scoring system, then we'll go back and keep checking that and keep verifying that you are indeed giving us these numbers. And if you don't, that can actually remove your tax credits and things like that. There's all kinds of different penalties and fines to the owner operators. And again, that's both on the for-profit developments and not-for-profits.
So just deviating a little bit, I just think of my own family. My great-grandparents came over from Croatia, the turn of the 19th century. They worked at all around a steel plant. They lived in tenement housing on one side of the tracks. Literally, after the next sort of ethnic groups showed up, they got to move on the other side of the tracks, which was basically working class housing. This is south of Buffalo, New York. That they didn't really have any education. My grandparents didn't have any education. My parents did. So no government support. 2 generations later, that was their story, and I think a lot of other people's stories 100+ years ago. In your gentleman's opinion, what's different now versus then? Was that okay? Is that, we had working conditions for people 100+ years ago that would be abhorrent to think about today. What's different? Is that okay? What can we do to change that? How good of an example is it that I just went through?
Well, let me go first on this one. And it's not exactly answering your exact question, but it's something that I always feel like I have to explain. When we are building new affordable housing complexes, we are not building a 1968 Bronx tenement building that's just horrible disrepair. It was poor when it was built at the beginning, and it's gotten even worse. We are built. I've been able to tour different developments all around the state, and walking through these are beautiful places. I mean, they have washers and dryers and just all different amenities that all of us would have expected. I go through some of these and I think, I would have lived here 25, 30 years ago when I was starting out. I mean, they're great. People just only hear about the rundown examples, and I think that in the past there wasn't as much monitoring and inspections and such that 30 years ago, yeah, the places got run down, and some of them are still out there that lots of times there's a land use restriction agreement, a LURA, for 15, 20, 30 years, sometimes even now 45 years. Once that runs out, we don't have any ability to inspect, enforce. Then it goes straight to the city inspectors and things like that. But I'm just saying that now, compared to even 30 years ago, the quality is so much more higher. The efficiencies and everything that's being built, the utilities, the washers and dryers are, fuel efficient and things like that. It's a big change from the way it was before. Not that I'm saying that it's not perfect. We all always hear about that, those one or two complexes that just the landlord just didn't care or died and someone else took it over, didn't know what they were doing. That's, I think, a positive difference now versus the way things were before.
I mean, first of all, I'd never bought a piece of investment real estate in my life before I did this. I'm really completely apolitical. I really could care less about all that stuff. So what I'm saying is has been my experiences since I got into this in 2019. Our tenants do things that make me sometimes scratch my head. There was a lady, her name was Ariel. I remember that because it's Hebrew. She wasn't Jewish, but it just stuck with me. She called me in Minnesota when I handled leasing, and she said, I'm homeless, I have 7 kids, my landlord backed out, and she's crying her eyes out. We had 4 homes in Minnesota at the time. I said, Ariel, I'll buy you a house. Complete fraud. She's like, there's absolutely no way. It's like, here's my cell phone, we're gonna buy you a house. We bought her a 5-bedroom home in a fantastic suburb of Minneapolis. Neighbors were phenomenal. She sent me pictures of her 7 kids in a new public school, everything. Well, our company got bigger, and I ceased to be the leasing agent. This is true. And we became kind of a real scalable company with processes and all that boring stuff. And one day, she called our leasing person and crying, and she said, Matthew doesn't return my calls anymore, I'm leaving the house. I was like, what are you doing? This was like the federal government, Leo's equivalent to Minnesota. They did everything right. She wasn't paying a dime. And I called her, and what I realized, this is a realization I came to, so I could answer Nick's question. I think for historical reasons, races, we could go on and on why. It really doesn't matter why. Or it does.
Immigrants coming over after our ancestors worked 200 years to build a GPA of this country, and we could not get a homestead. Veterans went to the Army, African Americans, and were denied that veterans benefit of buying a home for $1. $1. But immigrants could come over and purchase a home. And we wonder why they can't pull themselves up by their bootstraps. separated family, you couldn't even practice openly your value system, but somehow we persevered. And we're looking, and I know, I'm a former social worker, teacher at a school in Dallas. 98% lived in the home, in the project area. And what we did, we were able to be recognized and exemplary in DISD for 16 consecutive years. It's written up in, there's books, TEA, demonstration schools. Why do people lose the ability to be clean and keep homes? You know, it's all of this racist, institutionalized racism that most people don't even acknowledge, don't know exists. Thank you for
I see it. I see it. I see it. And what's your name?
Dr. Lucy Houston.
Dr. Lucy Houston. I see it, because I see it. And I want to finish the story about Ariel, because here's my answer to Nick's question. We have to, in our country, say that the problem was not created in a year or 10 years or 20, and the solution will take a long time for our tenants and their kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids for reasons that Dr. Houston, for reasons that you enunciated better than I could. That has been what I've seen. And in this country, we stand there like a referee with a stopwatch. Wait a second. We put you in Little Elm, and we paid your rent. How is it possible 2 years later, blah, blah, blah? Well, it's possible, and I tell this to our staff all the time. Every one of our tenants has PTSD. Every one of our tenants suffers from PTSD, 100% sure. So, well, I'm in Texas. I live in Manhattan mostly now, but I lived in Texas for a long time, and I come back, and I live here too. Let the Republicans, the Christians, the very spine of the Republican Party, go to their elected officials and say, we want to improve things. We want to improve housing. This is something important to us, either for religious reasons or God knows whatever reason. And that will help. And then I would say that people have to have a 2, 3, or 4 generation outlook, because the trauma is deep. It's very deep. And I say the story about Ariel not to malign at all, but to reveal to everybody here the extent of the trauma.
Okay, so we have just a couple more minutes. We want to give a chance for maybe 2 questions from the group. Sir?
I'm Volodymyr Burizhny. I'm immigrant, 1 year here.
From where?
From Ukraine. And I have 3 kids, right? So I hear this. I also follow Professor Scott Galloway from New York University, and he says one of those, like, American dream of home ownership is hallucination right now. It didn't happen anymore, so it's very different also. Capitalism is broken. So my question is to you, what position, if you can take any position, maybe presidential, the government will take, and what one thing you would first change in this country to make it, to change the thing for affordable housing real?
Well, the affordable housing, unfortunately, has so many global, macro, and local. There's so many things that affect it. I mean, I think that most of our problems are culture issues. I think Dr. Houston pointed out a lot. I think it's just asking yourself the question every day: who is my neighbor, and what does that mean, and what does citizenship mean? One of the things that I love about this country, and there's so many examples, but one that stands out to me is the Cajun Navy. When there's a natural disaster, and men and women of all colors who have fishing boats and have motors, they go and they rescue people, and they don't ask, what race are you? What color are you? How much money do you make? Can you get me in the country club? Like, I don't ask any of those questions. So it's that type of citizenship, culturally manifest, that I think is the beginning of the answer of all problems. I also tend to think that when people engage in the economy, in the marketplace, barriers, the things that Dr. Houston mentioned, lots of other things are reduced, because in the marketplace is where you engage as individuals. You don't attach as much labels. Now, there's all sorts of barriers to equal participation in the marketplace, but I think that those are some things that I focus on.
I want to say, it's money. Like, it's not that complicated. HUD's budget has increased below inflation over 50 years. When I know people in the civil rights community, because they like us, because of what we do, they were devastated when Biden had control of both houses of Congress, could have reconciled, he passed trillions of dollars for global warming, which one could argue is more of a white person problem, right? The house you have in Florida. I'm serious. I mean, that's the truth. So this is not just Republicans. I think that the Democrats had control of both houses of Congress, and they did nothing. HUD got $4 billion. That was it.
All right, let's do one more question, then you'll be here for people to come on up.
Our firm is one of the largest affordable housing developers. We are also on the market rate side. I'm a market rate guy. And I always had this argument over beers. The juice isn't worth the squeeze on the affordable side. It takes you 3 to 4 years to close. As a developer, you get 15% fee. I only get 4% on a market rate deal. 10% for financing. You got to build the same product, but it's the cost of compliance as a developer that makes no darn sense. Why would you do it?
Yeah, those are all relevant issues. We're 2 minutes over. I always believe in ending on time. Leo and Matthew, thank you. They'll be up here. If you really want an opinion, quiz Matthew off the record. They don't really give you what he really thinks about things. Leo, thank you. We know that our federal dollars are stewarded well with you, and appreciate everyone sitting in.